Welcome to Evidence Based, a new Harbinger psychology podcast. I'm your host, Cassie Stossel. On today's episode, we're discussing targeted solutions for anxiety and CBT skills that can provide lasting relief with Dr. David A. Clark, author of This Is What Anxiety Looks Like. David is a clinical psychologist and professor emeritus at the University of New Brunswick in Canada. He is author of several workbooks on depression and anxiety, including Overcoming Obsessive Thoughts, the Anxiety and Worry Workbook, the Anxious Thoughts Workbook, and the Negative Thoughts Workbook. He has co-authored several books with the pioneer of cognitive behavioral therapy, Aaron T. Beck, including Cognitive Therapy for Anxiety Disorders. Hi, David. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
The conversation we're about to have is going to be relatable for a lot of people. So I thought we could just kick off by talking about why anxiety manifests itself in so many different ways and what are some of those underlying processes that drive our anxiety.
Sure. So anxiety, the way I see anxiety, and I think probably most psychologists do, we see anxiety as an emotion. So that's the first thing where we start with it. And if you think what emotion is, there are many different ways that people express their emotions. Let's take an emotion like anger. Okay, so everybody feels anger from time to time. But what you might see in an individual when they're angry can be quite different. So, for example, we can think of maybe friends or family where they're very expressive with their anger. When they get upset, they're very vocal. They may use colorful language. In some cases, even get a little bit physical, which is very bad, I guess you could say, for individuals. Another person who gets angry might be quite quiet. They keep it to themselves. They hold it in, so to speak. Both individuals are angry. We would say they have that emotion, but they have a different way of expressing it. Now, if we come to anxiety, anxiety is exactly the same way. It's an emotion. And how people experience their anxiety, how they express it, will be different depending on a variety of factors. It can depend on the context, the situation that they're in. It can depend on their personality. Some people are more extroverted, and so when they get anxious, maybe they show it more. Another person may be a bit more introverted, so they're equally anxious, but it all seems to be inside. I've had various clients who would tell me when they're anxious, they're sitting in my office, they say, I'm very anxious right now, but I can't see anything. They're not trembling. They're not pacing. They don't seem to be agitated. And yet they sit there and they'll say, well, I'm feeling very anxious right now. And I'll say, well, what's that like for you? And they will describe it as an inside feeling. They say, well, I feel jumpy inside. I feel like, some will say, it feels like electricity, kind of coursing through my body. So the way we express anxiety can be different, the way we feel it. Some people, when they get anxious, when they feel anxiety, they feel it very physically. So it's a very physical manifestation. They have heart palpitations, maybe difficulty breathing. They may tremble, shake, feel weak kneed. I've had people who would have to grab onto something to hold, and they feel like they're going to fall over when they're anxious, feel dizzy and so on. So it's a very physical field for them, for some individuals. For others, however, the anxiety is much more what we call a cognitive. It's kind of in your head, manifests itself mainly as worry, thinking about something bad that could happen, and you feel this apprehension. So there may be far fewer physical sensations there, but it's more of the way you're thinking. So again, it's that internal anxiety. So yeah, so it's different in many different ways. But in the book, I talk about these core processes that underlie a lot of anxiety, these 13 processes that kind of manifest themselves in different combinations for people. So, for example, one of those processes I talk about is physiological arousal. So the person who has kind of panic attacks, so they may have a lot of physiological arousal, And then they would try to escape or avoid, and avoidance would be another one of those core processes. Now, if you think of somebody with social anxiety, they may have physiological anxiety, but added to that, they may also have a lot of anticipatory anxiety. So if you're doing a podcast, for example, like we're doing now, maybe you think about it for a day or two and you're a little bit nervous, anxious about it, and so on. And that's what we would call anticipatory anxiety. Not everybody who is anxious would necessarily have anticipatory anxiety, but very often, many times people do. And then there's another process called post event processing, where let's say after the podcast, you keep thinking to yourself, well, I wonder if I said something that wasn't quite right, or maybe I confused people in some way, or I made a mistake. And so you keep going over the event. And so after that event, let's say, you can become anxious about the way you performed, for example. So we have these different processes, and they can occur in different combinations, some more prominent for some people than in others. But at least a few of these are going to be evident in any anxiety that a person experiences.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. And I really enjoyed reading your book because a lot of these processes, like you said, go together or you experience them at different times. And for me personally, my first experiences with anxiety were physiological, where I didn't know I was anxious, but my body was telling me first. And now, over the years, it's morphed into some more of the cognitive issues, but it is interesting all these underlying things that sort of drive that anxiety. So I really liked in your book how you made them very accessible to understand.
Now, if I could just add to that, just an example from my own experience, I've had a couple of memorable anxiety experiences. I have lots that I forget about, because we all have anxiety from one time to another. And so, and then we just kind of forget about them. But I had a couple of memorable ones. And one was taking a crash course in scuba diving when I was on vacation. So the whole idea of this, and maybe people have done this when they're on vacation, but they go, oh, pay this certain amount of money and we'll spend 4 hours teaching you how to scuba dive, and then we'll take you out on a boat in the sea. And we're going to throw you overboard, and oh, you'll be okay. Don't worry about it, right? So I was in the swimming pool. I was only in about 4 feet of water, which is ridiculous with this class. I was the oldest guy there. I was in my probably about 50 or so. And I went underwater, had all the gear on, and I got this terrible sensation of I couldn't breathe. Well, of course, I had a regulator in my mouth. I was to breathe through the regulator, but I had this profound sense. And it was very physical for me. It was extremely physical. And I knew I was getting panicky. I knew what it was. And yet there I was. I was feeling like I was suffocating. And I stood up and I looked around. Everybody else is swimming around, all these 12 and 13-year-old kids. They're having a whale of a time. Me, I chickened out and I got out of the pool, right? And so that was one anxiety. And by the way, I finally did overcome that by taking a course and certification later on. But it was very physical. Another time when I have had anxiety is before I've made a major presentation, like a keynote address at like a world congress. This happened many years ago in Boston. And I remember just that feeling before getting up and speaking was very, very profound. Some physical sensations, but my head was going a mile a minute, terrified of who's going to be in that audience. I knew some of my colleagues would be there, and just the whole fear of embarrassing myself, maybe forgetting what I was going to say. So that was another example of intense anxiety, but very different.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that's really common when we are sort of in these anxious moments is we feel like we're not able to deal with whatever it is that we're anxious about. Why is that? And how do we sort of reframe that, I guess?
So, one of the things that happens, I think it's kind of a universal experience, is there a sense of a loss of control. You know it's anxiety, you know probably what you should do, but it feels like you can't control because you desperately want to get rid of the feeling. Nobody likes to feel anxious. We don't like that feeling. It's very unpleasant. And so the natural reaction, our whole brain body wants to get rid of the anxiety, right? And yet here it is, and we can't seem to control it. We have these heart palpitations. We have difficulty breathing, like in my scuba diving lesson. And yet I knew what was happening and I tried to regulate it, and yet it felt like I was out of control, right? So I think that's what makes it difficult and why it's so hard to cope. And we've all discovered, even as children, as toddlers, we know that if we escape whatever it is that's making us anxious, we immediately feel relief. So if you want to get rid of your anxiety, probably the most effective way to get rid of it is just to leave the situation. I get up out of the pool. That was it. I said to myself, I'm a 50-year-old Canadian. I'll never be a US Navy SEAL. I don't need to do this. And so I gave myself an out and I escaped, and my anxiety just disappeared instantly. I felt relief. We all do it. The problem with that strategy is if you have anxiety over and over, it's causing a lot of stress in your life, it's interfering in your ability to function. That escape and avoidance makes things worse because the anxiety gets prolonged, in a sense, becomes more persistent. And then what happens is you develop a sense of feeling helpless. And that's one of the other 13 processes I talk about in the book is that often if you've had chronic anxiety, you get to feel like you're different from other people and that maybe you're not emotionally strong. Maybe you better take it easy. Don't let yourself get too stressed. Maybe you better not do anything that's too far outside your comfort zone. Maybe stay away from novel stuff. Don't take any kind of trips where vacations, let's say, to exotic places that are maybe kind of challenge you a bit. Yeah, so you start to carve a lifestyle around the anxiety, let's say. But what happens is you then feel like you're different from everybody else. You begin to believe you're helpless, they're emotionally weak, and then you start to maybe develop dependency on family members, a partner, a close friend. And again, so there's this escalating cycle where the anxiety is taking over your life.
Yeah, and I think, what you're talking about is a lot of that anticipatory anxiety and avoiding all of those things that are potentially coming ahead for you. And just on a personal note, I'm curious. I deal a lot with this anticipatory anxiety after going through cancer treatment a year ago. Before that, I had a lot of health anxiety, which then did actually turn out to be me dealing with cancer. And now it's sort of this like waiting for the other shoe to drop for it to return. And both my husband and I get this anticipatory anxiety ahead of scans, even though the logic tells me that everything's been fine, or we get a cold and I suddenly think it's back. And so what are some ways to combat that if you know logically these things are coming up, maybe for someone who might have scans like I do, or like what you talked about with a presentation? What are some ways to manage that thinking ahead?
Right. So there are a couple of things there. First of all, and I'm glad you brought that up, Cassie, because a lot of times we have anxiety over things in our life that everybody would feel anxious about. So, if you've had a medical condition, if you've got follow-up treatments, follow-up assessments, and so on, yeah, you're going to be anxious. Of course, that's understandable. That's natural and normal. Now, it would be a terrible problem if that anxiety, let's say, stopped you from going back to your specialist and getting the scans and so on. Then that would be a big problem. That would be a huge problem, right? And obviously that hasn't happened. So lots of times our anxiety is understandable, right? You can understand why a person would be anxious. And I think health anxiety is a good example of that. And then other times our anxiety can be irrational almost, like for example, for some people are anxious to go to a supermarket that's crowded, or they have to take the same route to work because if they take a different route, they feel anxious. So then that's an anxiety that most people don't experience, but a few people do. So we have those two things. We have what I would call anxiety about life experiences that are pretty understandable and normal. And the reason for that is because you're facing a real life threat, right? So anxiety is always about threat, some fear of harm, psychological harm, physical harm coming to the individual. Anytime we have to experience a threat, we're going to feel anxiety. So it's not so much the feeling anxiety, it's what you are doing with the anxiety. So a couple of things. One is, and this is one of those 13 processes, it's the tolerance of uncertainty. So uncertainty is a huge driver in anxiety. If we knew for certain the good things that are going to happen to us, then I guess we would be excited and joyful. But if we knew for 100% and we're certain about the bad things that could happen to us or were going to happen to us, ironically, we may have less anxiety. The reality is that none of us can see the future. We can't predict the future. Our human ability doesn't allow that to happen. So we're constantly dealing with uncertainty. And of course, what you've described, that's a big uncertainty. The problem is that an individual, when we deal with uncertainty, then we would like to be able to convince ourselves that the worst won't happen. Okay, so one of the coping strategies that people often use is reassurance seeking.
Yep, I'm familiar with that one.
There's two ways of doing that reassurance seeking. One would be to ask friends and family. But if you think about it, that's kind of almost superstitious, isn't it? Like, how do they know your future any better than you know your future, right? So, in a sense, you're looking for them to say, oh, it'll be all right. Everything will be okay. You've been okay in the past, so on. But your brain, in the back of your head that's not really working terribly well, is it? Because you can say, yeah, well, how would they know, right? They're just trying to make me feel better, right? So that kind of reassurance doesn't work so well. And then the other one that we all use, what do? We Google, right? So we go and we look at if we have a diagnosis, we look up as much information as possible about our diagnosis, or if it's some symptom we have, we Google our symptom. And so what we're looking at is for reassurance. We're looking at, we want Google to say to us, hey, it's okay. Nothing's going to happen to you. It's just, people with a common cold often have a sore throat or whatever it is, right? That's what we're looking for. But of course, you know what happens, right? Then they give you the statistics. Well, in 10% of cases, this leads to certain death or something like that. And then that makes the anxiety much worse, doesn't it? Because what if you're the 1 in 10 or 1 in a million even, where this symptom or whatever it is doesn't work out, is really this worst case scenario. So coping with that uncertainty through reassurance seeking is not good. It doesn't work. It's ineffective. Avoiding, like if it would also be very counterproductive. So you certainly don't want to avoid. But it's kind of looking at it and saying, okay, what is it that's making me anxious? Well, it's what's making a person anxious is thinking about that terrible thing that could happen. So one of the interventions exercises often, at least for anticipatory anxiety, often say is, okay, I'd like you to write out, maybe in a paragraph or something, what would be the best possible outcome you can imagine. Maybe for the example that you've given, it might be everything's fine, the next 10 years, 20 years, whatever, everything's perfect, go live your life, and so on, right? That would be the very, very best outcome. If it's, you're worried about maybe humiliating yourself in a social event, it might be, you go to the party, you don't know anybody, everybody rushes up, they tell you what a great person you are, you're the life of the party, you have the best time in the world, and you make all these friends, and now you can add them all to your Facebook. So you've expanded your social media, presence or whatever. What's the worst that could happen? So, of course, if it's the health, the worst would be, the cancer's back or something to this effect. In the social situation, it might be the worst is you go to the party or dinner party, you meet these people, and they all think you're terrible. They all think, who is this person? There must be something wrong with her. Or he said such a silly thing. I mean, it's obviously not very bright, and so on. In other words, you make a terrible impression and you feel this intense anxiety throughout the whole evening, let's say. That's the worst case outcome. Now, think about something in between the very best and the very worst, okay? And something might be like this. I go to this social event. I feel anxious. I'm a bit shy. I find it hard to keep a conversation going, but I get through it. I, have a fairly decent conversation with one or two people. At the end of it, I'm happy that I went and I did it and so on. Maybe that's the most realistic outcome. And so then what you remind yourself is, okay, what is the most realistic, what is the most probable outcome? And usually it's something between the very best and the very worst. And what you can do then is spending your time preparing for that more likely middle ground, let's say, where it's not great, it's not the best, but it's also not the worst, and then you start to prepare for that middle ground. And that can help bring the anxiety down.
A good coping strategy.
Exactly.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hello, I'm Dr. Matthew McKay, creator of Therapy Assist. We've designed Therapy Assist to be an accessible and efficient platform. By providing a library of thousands of resources and the ability to customize workbooks, we're putting evidence-based tools in your hand, helping to improve client outcomes. Research consistently shows that between-session homework can significantly improve client outcomes and reduce dropout. But finding the right tools to assign can be time-consuming. Therapy Assist makes this process faster and easier. You can search through a library of curated resources, including psychoeducation, worksheets, exercises, meditations, and much more. You can use these resources both during your sessions and as homework assignments for clients, all with the confidence that they are rooted in evidence-based therapies. Therapy Assist's resource library is built on the firm foundation of New Harbinger Publications' 50-plus years of pioneering work in self-help and psychology. So you'll have resources created by world-renowned psychologists and researchers right at your fingertips. Our platform makes it easy for you to find exactly what you need with search filters and curated protocols. These comprehensive tools provide you with the ability to search for a resource by any combination of therapy type, presenting problem, transdiagnostic mechanism, intervention, or resource type. Therapy Assist helps you support more clients between sessions in less time. I know therapists often spend hours searching through files, books, or online to find the resources they need. Therapy Assist takes care of this for you, saving you valuable time you can use to focus on what matters most, helping your clients heal and thrive. With Therapy Assist, you can also review completed resources ahead of time, which means you'll be fully prepared for each session, ready to make the most of your time with your client. We understand the importance of having access to the most effective client resources in your work, and we're committed to continuously updating our library to keep pace with the latest research and cutting-edge tools in the field. Your client's privacy and security are top priorities for us. Therapy Assist is fully HIPAA compliant, so you can trust that the data entered is kept safe and confidential. To start your free trial and find out how Therapy Assist can transform your practice, go to therapyassist.com. We're here to support you every step of the way.
So, one thing I want to ask about, and I know I've been guilty of this before, but a lot of people define themselves by their anxiety, saying, I'm just a very anxious person, like sort of letting themselves off the hook for being anxious. But what are some ways to combat that thinking and rediscover who we are without that like anxious person label?
One of the things that I've done in the book, and I think more and more psychologists, psychiatrists are doing that. For so long, we thought of anxiety as like a health problem, like a condition. So people would get a diagnosis of panic disorder or social anxiety disorder or generalized anxiety, and so on. And so then that became kind of their label, and that started, in a sense, as you say, defining themselves in those terms, right? What we've done is to take what is called a process orientated view of anxiety, where we say, okay, if anxiety is a normal emotion and you can feel anxious in a whole variety of situations, instead of dealing with labels and diagnosis, let's treat anxiety as an emotion that sometimes can become a problem. When does it become a problem? When it feels overwhelming. It's what we call subjective distress, when it feels intensely distressing, and when it interferes in one's ability to function. Back in England, many decades ago, when I was a graduate student, one of the individuals I was assigned, my supervisor asked me to see and start some treatment, was an older man who had confined himself for 24 years to his home. Now, he didn't have mobility issues. He could walk. He didn't suffer from some cognitive problem, any form of dementia or anything. He was very coherent, very mobile, but he was terrified to go out the front door of his home. So for 24 years, he was housebound. The reason he was housebound was because he felt intense anxiety, even panic, anytime he tried to go through that front door. Even going to the gate of his, which was just a few feet, his front gate of his house, he would have like a panic attack. And so he had a severe form of what has been called agoraphobia or agoraphobia. That would be an extreme example, let's say, where anxiety has completely ruled his life, right? So, anxiety can be mild, moderate, severe. It can be, and for some people, it's pervasive. There's no question that there are people who have more anxiety than other people, and it's part of the personality, probably temperament. We know there is an anxious temperament. Some people are biologically, genetically predisposed to be more anxious and nervous, a bit more fearful. A huge amount of research showing even in infants that it can be picked up in infants and followed throughout the life cycle. So if that is your temperament, you are probably going to have more anxiety than someone whose temperament is calmer and, let's say, They don't seem to, they're able to take the novel and ambiguous more easily. So their temperament is different. But the critical thing is learning how to manage the anxiety so it doesn't get to the point where it's ruining your life in some way, ruling it in some way, and you don't become defined by it. If you think about it, it's like somebody who has a problem with anger. Maybe their life, there's been some misery in their life, problems in their life because they have this explosive anger. They need a way of working on that and dealing with that and trying to gain some control over that, obviously. And the same thing with anxiety. If you're kind of predisposed to be more anxious and nervous and fearful, then how can you reduce the impact of that in your life and learn to manage it a little more effectively?
Yeah, and what you're talking about reminds me of one of the examples in your book. You use a roller coaster as an example about you're talking about with anxiety reductions, and the physical symptoms are much less important than how you interpret them. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so that was taking my grandchildren and my daughter and husband to Disney World. So there was this roller coaster, not the little one that lots of families get on and so on, but this was a much bigger deal. And I have this healthy appreciation for roller coasters. I really hate the drop of death, the one, they go up, and then it goes. My 7-year-old granddaughter really wanted to get on this roller coaster, and she wanted me to get on as well. And I thought of all kinds of reasons why I could back out of it, my age, and so especially when they have the signs there, that says, if you are prone to heart attacks, don't go on this roller coaster. I did go on the roller coaster. And, they take these camera pictures a picture of you every once in a while. And I had intense physical symptoms, heart palpitations. I was tense. I could feel myself sweating. I was pretty ramped up for this thing. And I looked at her and I could tell that she was also pretty ramped up. Her eyes were dilated, they were big eyes. And, she was obviously fearful. The interesting thing is, as I'm on that roller coaster, I'm just absolutely hoping, anticipating, when will this thing get over? Please, can I get to the end of it? I did not like all that physiological arousal. I interpreted that as fear and anxiety and something I'd rather not have. Very unpleasant. She had that physiological arousal, but she said, wasn't it wonderful? It was so exciting. I had the time of my life. Let's go again. And I'm like, are you kidding me? No way. I got through it once. I'm not doing it again. But the thing here is, we both had that physiological arousal ramped up. My interpretation was fear and anxiety. I don't want to do that again. I'm going to avoid it at all. Her interpretation of physiological arousal was excitement. She enjoyed it. She enjoyed the physiological. I did not enjoy the physiological arousal. And over the years, just to broaden this a little bit, this discussion, I've worked with veterans and veterans who have post-traumatic stress disorder. And in PTSD, there's a lot of anxiety in PTSD. There's a lot of things that veterans who have experienced combat and trauma, they will then avoid many different things. The interesting thing is we often have these discussions, and I'm not a veteran, so I don't have combat experience. So I've asked them, what is it like? This would be infantry in combat. And what is it like walking into a crowded Costco store? Which is interesting because when they're on the battlefield, they, heart palpitations, they're breathing heavy, they're tense, their eyes are dilated, they're very, very vigilant, they're looking around. I mean, they're in danger. People are shooting, there's bombs, they could lose their life. I mean, absolutely. In Costco, they may have heart palpitations, sweating, tense, and so on. But there's no reason for it. I mean, nobody's shooting at it's not life threatening. And the difference seems to be in the interpretation. So the interpretation is when I'm on the battlefield for these men and women, when I'm on the battlefield, of course I'm all ramped up. And they interpret that in kind of a positive way, that I'm battle ready, I'm vigilant, I'm keyed up, I need to be alert and so on. And they would say, yes, it's fear, but of course it's fear. You should be afraid. Whereas when they would experience those symptoms in Costco, they would go, what's wrong with me? I shouldn't be feeling this way. There must be something, I don't know. Do I have a mental illness? Why am I feeling this way? And so they interpret the physical symptoms as abnormal, and then they leave. And they go, oh, no, I can't do Costco. My partner, my spouse, they'll have to do the shopping on their own. I'll sit out in the truck or whatever in the parking lot, or maybe I'll stay at home. I just can't deal with that.
What is interesting too about that avoidance that you're talking about, like maybe I'll leave the Costco, is, at least for me, when I have avoided something that I perceive to make me anxious, I feel guilty sometimes. I self-blame. Can you talk about sort of those feelings that come up from the experiences of your anxiety, like maybe the avoidance in particular?
The problem with avoidance as well is nobody feels great about avoiding something, particularly if it's something that's probably, let's say, everyday experience. Everyone else around you can do it. They're flying, they're taking vacations places, they're going shopping, they're seeing friends, and you keep, let's say, as an individual with anxiety, if you keep saying no, 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 and you avoid these things, you can't help but feel defeated. You feel like the anxiety has the best of you. You don't feel good about yourself, right? You don't feel strong. You don't feel autonomous, resilient, or anything. It's the opposite of that. And the other thing, the guilt comes in, is because you start depending on other people. Let's say you have a young family, and so your partner is doing everything. They're working, they're looking after the house, they're looking after the children, they're doing the errands, they're dealing with the finances, on and on and on and on. And what are you doing? Let's say, well, you look at it and think, well, I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't let myself get too stressed. Maybe you self-medicate, and you obviously are going to feel guilty because you're not pulling your weight as well. And you fear that there's going to be a breaking point at some point where maybe your relationship will be in jeopardy and so on, because let's say your partner says, or a family member says, I can't take it anymore. I can't take doing everything. Yeah. So you end up with self-blame. You end up feeling guilty. You end up feeling very diminished as an individual. Now, I'd like to add one more thing, because one of the interventions that is the most powerful for anxiety and fear is what we call exposure therapy. In fact, I've had clients over the years that say, look, I'm willing to do any treatment at all. Just don't do exposure. Don't do exposure. And it's the most effective. I mean, we've had decades now of research to show that exposure-based interventions are the most effective. Even with medication, if you're taking medication for anxiety, but you're still avoiding, you're still not doing things, the medication isn't going to be particularly helpful in that regard. So the medication is most helpful if it brings down the feeling of anxiousness, and then you're able to do things. You get out there, and so you're exposing yourself. The problem with exposure is it's not like you can do one and done. It's not that way. you expose yourself, and it's kind of a very anxiety-provoking experience. You get through it, you say, okay. It's not like the anxiety disappears and it's gone forever. Now, I mentioned to you about my fear of scuba diving. Over the next 2 years, didn't do any scuba diving, nothing. And I had lots of clients with panic and anxiety. And I would talk about exposure therapy. You got to get back there. Let's work on this. And, and I felt like such a hypocrite because there's like a little voice in the back of my head. Yeah, but you're scared to scuba dive. So what I did is eventually I thought, I got to get over this. Even though who cares whether you can scuba dive? It doesn't matter, right? But I got to get over this. I don't feel good about myself. I feel defeated by this. So I signed up for a certification course that required, I think it was for 10 weeks. I went through those 10 weeks, and every week on a Sunday night, that's when they were, every Sunday afternoon I felt anxious. Every Sunday for 10 weeks. And, I'm a psychologist, so I thought, well, what's going on here? Like, this is crazy. And at the end of the lesson on that Sunday night, I'd come home. I feel so good about myself. I did it. I put the gear on. I went in the water and I swam around and I conquered this thing. The next Sunday, anxious again. Did my checkout dives. Terrible conditions. Very, very anxious. Almost panicky doing the checkout dives. Did the checkout dives, got certified. Then I started to do some diving. Every time I dived, I'd feel anxious. Here's the thing. I never had a traumatic, terrible experience scuba diving. I never ran out of air or anything like that. But the anxiety kept coming back. Now, it got a little bit easier, I must admit, the more I did it. The last time I dove, I was always the last person out of the boat. And I was always, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. And sometimes I dove at Maui, wonderful conditions, perfect. Still, I was the last one out of the boat. And just before I got out, the instructor, the guide, checked my gear. He said, oh, you've got a leak in your tank. So it was a good thing. That didn't help me at all.
No, sure.
My point is this, despite all that exposure, I still felt some anxiety. And that is the problem. There lots of times people think if I keep doing it, then I'll get to the point where I'll have no anxiety. That might happen, but it also might not happen. You might also be left with what we call residual anxiety, that you have to go, okay, gear up, let's do this again. But it gets a bit easier.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're talking about too is obviously you cared about diving enough to keep going back into to expose yourself to that regularly. I think a good example, I've been doing this podcast for 2 years. I'm not a psychologist. I don't have, a degree in psychology. So I get nervous talking to all the experts and I worry about coming off not educated in what I'm talking about, but I still do it. I still come and I schedule these interviews and I talk. And so I think the care, like you obviously care about that thing, even though you were avoiding it.
Yeah. And here's the thing. And if I can, you come back and you do a great job. It's fine. It's working out. You do many podcasts and I'm sure, people find them helpful and all this and it's working. And so you can, at the end of it, you can say, well, that went well. But that doesn't mean that the next time there will be no anxiety, because that anxiety will come back. Why? It's a normal emotion. What we are dealing with is our feelings, our emotion. And this one is anxiety. Because there's always a bit of uncertainty, and you could have a disastrous podcast or something could go terribly wrong or whatever, right? It's possible. Threat and danger are a possibility. Therefore, we're always going to have a little bit of anxiety.
Yeah, sure. And I know I mentioned this earlier, but I just want to say it again, talking about the accessibility of this book in particular. It made everything very easy to understand. And I think it it sort of normalized a lot of the feelings that a lot of us go through with anxiety. And as we wrap up, do you have any advice for the folks who are sort of just beginning to understand how their anxiety works and understand the processes that it's working behind their anxiety?
So yeah, and a couple of things. I think one is to know your anxiety, and that's the first couple of chapters in the book. What I try to do is to lay out a fairly simple scheme, a fairly simple way to look at your anxiety, and rather than trying, let's say, rather than getting stuck in a label like, oh, I have panic disorder or I have generalized anxiety or whatever, is to say, okay, where am I getting anxious? What situations cause me more than just a mild anxiety, but a fairly intense experience of anxiety that's maybe causing me to avoid or whatever. So you look at those situations. Okay, now what am I experiencing when I feel anxious? What's going through my head? Am I catastrophizing, just getting locked into the very worst that could happen? Am I struggling with uncertainty, right? Is the anticipatory anxiety the worst part? I've had many clients who've told me it's the anticipation that's far worse than when they get in the situation. They kind of get in the situation, they kind of settle down and it goes okay, but it's anticipating it that's the worst, okay? So you kind of go through these processes and say, okay, what is most prominent in my anxiety? Am I doing way too much escape and avoidance, for example? Am I doing too much reassurance seeking? So you kind of map it all out. What are these processes that are most critical in defining your anxiety? What are the goals? What would you like to achieve? If you could have less anxiety or manage your anxiety better, what would you like to be able to do that anxiety is not letting you do now? For example, there are some people who are very anxious at work, and so they're doing all remote work. So that's fine if your company says, okay, remote work is good, we don't mind. But there are many, many companies now that are trying to get their employees back to the office. And let's say you're reluctant to go back because of anxiety, but then that could be interfering in your ability to get promotions, let's say, or whatever. So maybe your goal becomes, okay, I need to get back to work at least 3 days a week or 2 days a week or whatever the company is asking you to do. So that becomes a goal. So you've got, okay, what are the situations triggering it? What are my goals? What I'd like to do? And then the middle part there are what are the processes? What are the characteristics of my anxiety that I need to work on? And then you drill into that. If it's avoidance, if it's a lot of reassurance seeking, if it's the physiological arousal, if it's the catastrophizing, it could be a combination of those things. It could be nothing. One of the processes that I talk about is what we call neutralization. Well, lots and lots of people have anxiety that they don't neutralize necessarily. What we mean by neutralizing is they develop a ritual. But if you have obsessive compulsive disorder, or condition, I should say, I don't like to use the word disorder, condition, then maybe you do a lot of ritualizing as a way to deal with the anxiety. So you wash compulsively or you check way too much and so on. So then that becomes a process to work, right? So first of all, it's knowing the anxiety, which are the processes you need to drill into, and then using the intervention. I talk about 2 or 3 in each chapter that can be used to kind of learn to manage and overcome that characteristic or that process that is driving up your anxiety.
Yeah, David, that sounds like a good place for us to wrap up unless you have any final thoughts for the listeners.
Facing fear and anxiety requires enormous courage. And I must admit, I've admired over the years people who have been determined to work on their anxiety, to get a handle on it. even though I know it's difficult, it's somewhat painful, you're doing the thing that you dislike the most. And, sometimes I've said, overcoming your anxiety to go to Costco it takes courage to do that. Now I can go to Costco, there's no problem, and probably you do as well. You're like, okay, we go, or a crowded supermarket or whatever. But when that situation elicits fear and anxiety, fear is fear. Anxiety is anxiety, right? And it does take courage and determination to deal with that, to overcome it, to manage it. I like the word managing better because you can't eliminate the feeling. It's normal to feel some fear and anxiety. So you can't live an anxiety-free life, but what you can do is minimize the adverse effects of the anxiety.
Yeah, thank you so much, David, for sharing your personal stories with anxiety and for all the work you're doing in this area. It's so valuable. So thank you so much for your time.
Okay, and thank you, Cassie, for this opportunity. It's been great talking to you.
Proven effective tools for when you feel like the world is closing in on you. Anxiety has many faces. It can look like chronic avoidance, rumination, fear of uncertainty, reassurance seeking, catastrophic thinking, or fear of losing control. There's more than a dozen recognized categories of anxiety, but they all have one thing in common. They all get in the way of living your life. Your work suffers, your family suffers, you suffer, but you don't have to. Written by psychologist and anxiety expert David A. Clark, this essential guide offers targeted, proven solutions to take charge of your anxiety and your life. This is what anxiety looks like dives right into relatable case studies using a story-based approach to help you overcome the 13 most common causes of anxiety so you can live with less worry and fear. Drawing on powerful and evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapy and grounded in decades of research and clinical experience, Clark offers real-world tips and strategies to help you find the relief you're seeking starting right now. With this guide, you'll also learn to identify the disturbing thoughts and habits that make your anxiety worse, use targeted skills to manage your symptoms, break the cycle of anxiety, worry, and catastrophic thinking, find lasting calm and peace of mind. In our increasingly uncertain world, there's plenty to worry about, but you can move past the mental habits that shape your anxiety no matter what it looks like. This book will help you get started today. Visit our website at www.newharbinger.com and use coupon code podcast25 to receive 25% off your entire order. New Harbinger Publications is an independent, employee-owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For over 50 years, our evidence-based self-help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well-being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee-owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change. Join the New Harbinger Clinicians Club, a free membership club exclusively for mental health professionals. Sign up today and you'll receive a special welcome gift, 35% off all professional books, free client resources, free ebooks throughout the year, access to private sales, a subscription to our Quick Tips for Therapists email program, and more. Visit newharbinger.com/clinicians-club for more information. Do you have an idea for another episode? Do you want to send us a message? Our email address is podcast@newharbinger.com. We'd love to hear from you. This podcast was edited by Jesse Fancushion. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope that you might share it with anyone who could benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.